All right, Gerald, good to see you again. You got another, first of all, you got another book. This is number what?
Well, let's say 3 dozen.
So this was the one. So was it when you were doing COVID? You had so much extra time. You said, "Let me just crank this one out."
Well, basically, what happened, to get down into the weeds, is that with COVID, I went into lockdown that I did not exit until last fall. But what I did was I obtained a microfilm reading machine, and that allowed me to read a lot of microfilm, particularly from the early days of Texas and Mexico, and take notes and help to produce this book.
Wow. Wow. Well, I mean, it's first of all, it's a whole lot. And before we actually get into the book, again, for folks who just don't understand this process, I mean, how much? First of all, we're talking about 575 pages. How long did it take you to research and write?
Well, that's a good question. Keep in mind, when you do these books, you don't work on them every day. At least I don't. And because usually I'm working on 2 or 3, perhaps 4 projects at a time. Having said that, I would say that this book, which was published in 2022, I probably began in 2016, 2017.
Wow. So about a 5-year period.
Exactly.
So you called it the counter-revolution of 1836. Why?
Well, as you know more than most, given your roots in the U.S. Southwest, Texas was once part of Mexico. But the slave owners of Texas, led by Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston, who gave their names to 2 of the major cities in what is now a U.S. state, were opposed to the abolition of slavery in Mexico, executed by a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, 200 years, by the way, before the election of Barack Obama in the United States in 2008. And rather than accede to abolition, they seceded, fought a war, defeated Mexico on the battlefield, not least with armed resistance and supplies from the United States of America, and then began to expand the enslavement of Africans. In fact, when Texas was an independent country between 1836 and 1845, not only could the slave ships of the Lone Star State be found off the coast of Angola and Brazil and Cuba, but as well, keep in mind that these leaders in Texas were so full of themselves that they thought that they could challenge the United States of America, despite the fact that the States of America helped them to solidify their independence from Mexico. So it's a very tawdry tale, at least in the early stages. And I don't feel you can begin to understand why it is that Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America as we speak, without understanding this history. And I don't think you can begin to understand why Texas plays an outsized role in right-wing politics in the United States of America without understanding the anti-African sentiment that helped to drive independence and then statehood, and without understanding as well the bloody wars against the indigenous population. In fact, even though California might quibble with this point, Texas probably had the bloodiest wars of all against the indigenous population, which at the end of the day helped to create more land and territory for the enslavement of Africans.
It's interesting. The other day I was on social media and I came across something that was interesting. There was a brother who did a video to explain why there's a sliver of Oklahoma that's just above the panhandle in Texas. And in the video, he goes, slavery. And again, as a native Texan, I saw that and I was like, wow, I didn't even realize that. Explain that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. The shape of Oklahoma has been described as a bloody cleaver hanging over Texas. It's interesting about the state of Oklahoma as well. I'm sure you have listeners in the Sooner State. And Oklahoma was originally designed to be a Bantustan, not unlike what you had during apartheid South Africa, where the Africans were moved into certain territories and not allowed to move elsewhere. Recall that then US President Andrew Jackson, who was Donald Trump's favorite president, he had his picture hanging on the wall in his office. It was Andrew Jackson who now graces the $20 bill, perhaps more accurately, disgraces the $20 bill, who expelled the indigenous population of the Southeast Quadrant of the United States, present-day Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and told them they could live in this Bantustan, Indian territory, for as long as the water shall flow and the grass shall grow. And what's interesting about some of these indigenous populations, particularly the Cherokee, was that they were willing to accommodate themselves and assimilate to Euro-American society, converting to Christianity, becoming sedentary farmers, up to and including enslaving Africans, by the way. And so when they were expelled, they brought their enslaved property with them to Indian territory. But alas, as you know more than most, Black people in North America have a penchant for rebellion, and they began to rebel against Native American territory. And it was very difficult for them because they had to cross Texas territory to get to freedom in Mexico. So this is a very troubled history. And once again, I don't think you can begin to understand the rancid conservatism that now persists in Oklahoma and Texas without understanding this history. And by the way, allow me to make a footnote about the Tulsa massacre of 100 odd years ago. I'm sure many in your audience are familiar with what happened in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, oftentimes described as Black Wall Street. And to the extent that the nickname is accurate, you have to trace it back to the slavery days. You have to trace it back to 1865 when slavery was abolished, and the Indian slave owners were forced to disgorge more of their wealth and property to the formerly enslaved than their Euro-American counterparts. And that helped to create a somewhat relatively lucrative community, affluent community, I should say. And this was too much for many of the settlers. And that led directly to the Tulsa massacre circa 1921, when hundreds were massacred. Their graves are still being uncovered as we speak. Many of them were forced to flee. Some of them left the country. Some of them moved to Canada. So once again, this is a very unfortunate history that needs to be better known.
So on the cover here, you have an image of folks being lynched. You have the Texas flag, but you have this Nazi flag. Why?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the direction in which the United States is heading right now is very perilous. It's not me who's raised the F word instantly. Recall that during the campaigns, congressional campaigns last year, President Joseph R. Biden suggested that the United States under Republican Party rule could be headed towards fascism. It was the late Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who wrote an entire book, Fascism, A Warning, about that. Many leaders, intellectuals are very concerned about this, which could portend the acceleration of already toxic trends, those toxic trends being more Black people on death row, more Black people being subjected to police terror, more Black people treated like Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, with the authorities knocking down your door and coming in and killing you. And so what I'm arguing in this book is that to the extent that we are worried about the rise of fascism in the United States, which once again would just be an acceleration of already existing trends, we have to understand that Texas in particular has created fertile soil for the rise of fascism, given the fact that it was a premier state for enslavement. As I talk about in the book, as the so-called Confederate States of America was collapsing, I'm speaking of the states in the Deep South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, et cetera. Recall that in 1861, they decided to leave the United States because they wanted to enslave Africans forevermore and overthrow the government under Abraham Lincoln and Washington as a result. As their dream was collapsing, you saw that many enslavers began to move en masse to Texas with their property in tow because they felt that Texas had the best chance of surviving and basically continuing slavery.
Attention! We're back, bigger and stronger than ever. Season 2 is reloading May 26th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.
What's up?
Being a black man, we gotta stop letting it slide.
With new hosts
Let me tell you what damn time it is.
and big celebrity surprises.
Kiss my behind, it's Oprah Winfrey.
Subscribe today at Truth Talks Live
Give black people what they need, and we'll show them, please.
and don't miss out on all the upcoming viral moments.
Simulcasting weeknights at 8 p.m. on Roland Martin Unfiltered and Black Star Network and Truth Talks Live. I'll see you there.
There's a story about Juneteenth that I could tell if we have time that helps to illustrate that point.
Yeah, we got time.
Okay, well, let me digress for a moment. You know the story about Juneteenth, I'm sure. June 16th, 1865, supposedly General Granger of the U.S. government shows up in Galveston and tells the enslaved Africans, hey, did you people know you were free? Didn't you hear about the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863? Well, that's more or less a fairy tale because the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln did not apply in jurisdictions that Lincoln did not control. It would be as if the U.S. Congress passed a resolution saying that slavery is abolished in, let us say, Mauritania and Northwest Africa. Well, unless the U.S. Congress put boots on the ground in Northwest Africa, and I don't want to put ideas in their head, given their propensity for intervening in foreign lands, unless they put boots on the ground, that would just basically be a paper resolution. And that was the impact and effect of the Emancipation Proclamation until General Granger and his troops showed up to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. The Africans in Galveston, they knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, but what could they do? They were being forced at gunpoint to work for free. But what happens is that during the period of the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a close ally of the slave owners, speaking of France, had seized control of Mexico. This leads to the Mexican-American holiday, Cinco de Mayo, which you may be familiar with, your audience may be familiar with, which celebrates a victory of Mexican opposition forces over the French occupiers. So the idea in Texas and in the Confederate States in general was to retreat en masse to the border area with Mexico, perhaps go back into Mexico and reverse the abolitionist decree that I mentioned a moment or two ago, issued by the Black president, Vicente Guerrero, and continue enslavement of Africans forevermore. But what happens is that the U.S. Army then had a few 100,000 Black men in uniform with guns in their hand. They allied with Mexican opposition forces led by the Mexican national hero, Benito Juarez. Ciudad Juarez, just across the border from El Paso, Texas, is named after him. And they helped to crush the French occupiers. And in fact, that helped to crush the idea that slavery would continue in Mexico in league with Texas enslavers and Virginia enslavers and Carolina enslavers. And one could fairly say that the real Juneteenth is June 19th, 1867, when the Black men with guns in hand, allied with Mexicans also with guns in hand, crushed the French occupiers, and not only crushed the French occupiers, but then execute the French leader in Mexico, Maximilian, on June 19th, 1867. And that brings the United States closer to enslavement, more so than the original story of Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, which we had been fed.
What's interesting about that is because when you look at, again, Texas lore, those of us born and raised in Texas, required to have Texas history in the 7th grade, when we're told about the Alamo and this great story about the fight to save Texas. The Alamo was about slavery.
Absolutely. And of course, many of the Euro-American settlers who were, quote, defending, unquote, the Alamo against incursions from Mexican forces were not only enslavers, but in some cases, slave traders. And it's interesting, as I point out in the book, one of the ways we know what happened in the Alamo, which, as you, I'm sure, recall, is cited within the confines of San Antonio, Texas, is that an enslaved African was either allowed to escape by Mexicans or somehow escape, and he was then able to spread the story of what happened at the Alamo, which has now become a kind of a sacred site with regard to many Texans. You may know that a lot of our tax dollars in Texas have been spent restoring the Alamo. The British musician who now lives in the United States, speaking of Phil Collins, has become a benefactor of the Alamo site for whatever reason. I'm not really sure how he got so intrigued by this story, and has pumped a lot of his fortune into restoring the Alamo. It's a very curious story.
Well, I think that the reason I raise that is because I think back to the phrase that you always heard Paul Harvey say, "Now the rest of the story."
Right.
And when I think about the attacks on the 1619 Project, when I think about the attacks on Black historians, when I think about when we talk about the redefinition of American history, again, as somebody who was born and raised in Texas, we were raised to celebrate the Alamo. It was about Texas fighting against these savages from Mexico who were trying to take over, and these were independent-minded people. And so you got Black folks who are walking around, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo, and movies were made about it. And so you want us to remember that the people who were fighting for the Alamo wanted to keep us in chains. And what they want is, and bring in present day, they don't want people today to know or as Paul Harvey said, the rest of the story, the other side of that story. And so we want to keep up this fantasy, because in this country, that's what it's all about. The fantasy of American history, where white Americans were always the saviors and were perfect and they were just wonderful, when in fact, what we're talking about are just prime examples of pure evil.
Well, that's an understatement, I'm afraid to say. And this is very serious. Even though we're talking about events of the past, they have contemporary resonance. That's the only way to explain what's going on in the state of Florida now, with Governor DeSantis, who is now on the verge of declaring that he will be running for the Republican nomination for president against Mr. Trump, has campaigned relentlessly with regard to what he describes as, quote, wokeness, unquote, which in many ways comes down to campaigning against an accurate rendition of Black history. That's why he sought to circumscribe the teaching of advanced placement African American studies in secondary schools in the state of Florida. That's why in the New York Times today, March 30th, 2023, you have an article by Charles Blow, the Black columnist, who describes an effort in the state of Florida to prevent the showing of a docudrama about the little Black girl, Ruby Bridges, in Louisiana, who tried to desegregate a school and was subjected to harassment and persecution by Euro-American adults as a direct result. That's why in the state of Florida, you have campaigns against novels by the Nobel laureate, the late Black woman writer and creator, Toni Morrison. It's not as if this campaign is directed against any ideas about overthrowing the United States government or something of that sort. It's just there's a campaign against an accurate rendition of Black history. And there are those like Governor DeSantis and his acolytes who feel that an accurate rendition of Black history calls into question the creation myth about the United States of America. That is to say that it is a flawless nation. It's a nation without blemishes, that in order to uphold that fiction and fantasy, we have to whitewash, pardon the expression, great swaths of the historical record. And this is quite dangerous, as I'm sure you can understand, to our younger people in particular. Because on the one hand, they're growing up wondering why it is that they're being harassed by the police, why they're being stopped when they're driving their cars, and others who do not have the same content of melanin or not treated similarly. And if they had a better understanding of the history of this country, they can understand the reality of this country. And if they can understand the reality of this country, they might want to protest against the reality of this country. But Governor DeSantis and his comrades, the last thing they want to see is the specter of Black people protesting against racism and white supremacy.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.
For me, why all of this is so vitally important is because I've long talked about the need for there to be a reprogramming of African Americans. in that how we approach certain things, how we look at certain things. And when you begin to read and begin to study and begin to realize how powerful white supremacy has been, what it has created, but not just white supremacy, how it's impacted African Americans, also how white supremacy has impacted whites, in that what this other framing of the story has done is to give them a false view. And I believe, which was the thesis of my book, White Fear, the reason these white folks, these baby boomers, and some of these Gen Xers are so angry right now is because they can't handle the fact that their white children and their white grandchildren are now hearing the other side of the story. And they're now looking at America in a much different way. And they're now challenging America. And so this effort to attack DEI and critical race theory, to attack anything dealing with race, where you're right, white kid in a government class is uncomfortable when civil rights comes up, so the class is canceled. Let's not show, the language in this movie about Ruby Bridges. We can't have a little young white kid seeing that because they might feel bad when they hear the N-word being spoken, because they might start asking, Grandmama, was that you? And so that's really what we're dealing with. And we're dealing with people, if they say, if we could just stop the Gerald Horns of the world from writing and teaching and these white kids from learning, then we may hold on to this fallacy as long as we can. And that's really what the aim is.
Well, I'm afraid that you're right, but I hope I'm not going out on a limb when I suggest that that is a losing struggle. Because even if somehow the Governor DeSantis of the world were able to circumscribe the teaching of accurate renditions of Black history in Florida, that does not necessarily mean that that particular campaign will succeed in Brooklyn. It does not necessarily mean that it'll succeed in Berkeley or Los Angeles. And given that this is one country, which is wired through broadband, it will not be that difficult for the kids in Florida to get stories from Los Angeles, from Berkeley, and from Brooklyn. And another thing, Roland, I'm on the project, and just before we got on this call, I was looking at reports from Ethiopia in the 1920s, where this Ethiopia, of course, at that particular time was one of the few sovereign states, along with Liberia, which was basically a neo-colony in a sense of the United States. And Ethiopia was wielding significant diplomatic influence because it was independent and sovereign. It was being courted by Russia, being courted by France, England, Italy, etc. And the leaders were playing off one against another. And the United States was trying to curry favor with Ethiopia. And so they were asking the Ethiopians to send their young people to the United States to study, which the Ethiopians did. But then the young Ethiopians began to complain about Jim Crow and U.S. apartheid, which was worsening the U.S. reputation in Addis Ababa. And so this puts pressure on the United States to move away from that hateful, spiteful system, which ultimately then benefits Black Americans, people like your grandparents and my grandparents. And so once again, in the 21st century, Florida is not an island. It's going to be very difficult for Florida to push through these anti-Black policies, not only in the face of opposition from Berkeley, Brooklyn, and Los Angeles, but also in the face of global opposition from Africans. Now the entire continent virtually is sovereign. The United States actually wants to attract more Black students to campuses here because to this point, the leading foreign students came from China, but now the United States-China relations are headed south. And so they want to replace these Chinese students with African students. But how are they going to do that when Black people are treated so shabbily in this country. So once again, you see this global pressure, this global dynamic, and hopefully that will lead to a reversal of Governor DeSantis's policies.
As you were talking, I'm sitting here pulling up various items and how folks are framing different things, describing the Texas Revolution, talking about it was a cause about federalism, it was about freedom, it was about independence. And see, again, those are buzzwords that's very easy to rally around. Yes, that's we love the idea of being separate and independent and not having Mexican authorities in control of this. But as you laid out, they were abolitionists in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had folks who were angry with that. Just like all these people are just, boy, that Lord have mercy. They really hot at you when you framed the issue with the ending of slavery in Britain as one of the reasons for the American Revolution. And all the historians, oh, absolutely not. It had nothing to do with that. And again, it goes to this denial of the reality of how powerful slavery was. And for the people who who are clueless, it was the principal economic engine of America. And so this to act as if, oh, that was just sort of one part of this is really it was really other issues. No, you can't say it was everything. It was the central thing. And so again, what you have are folks who do not want that to be told. And now that we can read, now that we can research, now that we can write, I use the phrase all the time, Gerald. We are living examples of their worst nightmare. Negroes who can read. And now we can write, and now we can publish, and now we can broadcast. Oh hell, we are absolutely a threat to this whole system.
Well, it's interesting. It's not only that on the verge of the U.S. Civil War, 1860, the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans was the most valuable investment in this country, more valuable than the railroads and the factories than the mines. It's not only that, but when slavery was abolished in 1865, or per my previous remarks, guaranteed in 1867 with the overthrow of the French occupiers in Mexico, what happened is that those who controlled those billions in property, their property was taken without compensation. Now, interestingly enough, when slavery was ultimately abolished in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, etc., the enslavers were compensated. Up until a few years ago, London was continuing to pay off the descendants of the families who owned the enslaved. You know the story, I'm sure, about the abolition of slavery by force of arms in what is now Haiti, and then independent Haiti forced to pay reparations to the enslavers, which has crippled independent Haiti to this very day. In the United States, there was no compensation paid to those whose property, quote unquote, was taken, quote unquote. And obviously that generates fury. When I'm teaching classes at the University of Houston and telling this story, you know how students are today. I'm lecturing and they're fiddling with their smartphones for whatever reason, on TikTok or Facebook or whatever. And sometimes I'll go and snatch the smartphone from the student's hand and say, look, I've just taken your property without compensation. You're angry, right? You're furious, right? You want to take me outside and thrash me. Well, that's how the enslavers felt, or the former enslavers, I should say, felt in Texas and a good deal of Dixie, which leads to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which had one of its strongest chapters in Texas, by the way. The Ku Klux Klan, for those who have been living under a rock in recent decades, was the terrorist white supremacist organization that sought to bring back what they considered to be the good old days of relentless and ruthless exploitation of people of African descent. And I would argue that in part, that decision is still relevant. That is to say, the decision to expropriate the property of the enslavers without compensation, because I think it helps to generate this anti-Washington sentiment that you now see. Anything coming out of Washington, according to the conservatives, is bad, unless, of course, it benefits the military-industrial complex or the oil industry, et cetera. But, they'll basically organize a relentless campaign against what they call Obamacare, because it's coming out of Washington and is at the behest of a president of African descent. You have many people going against their own interests just because it comes out of Washington, for example. The U.S. economy may seize up within weeks because of this debate over the United States paying its debts, which could jeopardize the potency and the viability of the entire U.S. economy, generated by this anti-Washington sentiment that I would argue comes from the fact that it was Washington, the federal government, that presided over the expropriation of their property without compensation. It was Washington, the federal government, that defeated the dream of establishing a so-called Confederate States of America that would enslave Africans forevermore. And until we come to these very basic realizations, I'm afraid to say we're always going to be stumbling around in the dark.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
When we talk about the Great Compromise of 1877, which ushers in 92 years of Jim Crow, we think about even with the state of Texas, the battles there when it came to Thurgood Marshall and NAACP and others trying to break the backs of the Democratic primaries. When we look at, again, the systems that we're putting in place, as you laid out, Jim Crow and the roots of U.S. fascism. I mean, what people just simply refuse to acknowledge is that all of these things, you have to look at present day things and to understand what led up to this, what created this, what put this in place, the boundaries, the living conditions. When you just think back to just the treatment. There's a movie being made about that black brigade of soldiers who got so sick of racism, went on and just started killing white folks in Houston, and very few people even know about that story. And so when you talk about this counter-revolution of 1836, we talk about Juneteenth. I keep reminding people, y'all, the celebration of Juneteenth by Black folks wasn't just about General Granger. It was literally this continual quest for freedom in Texas and in America.
Well, I'm happy to hear that a movie is being made about what's been called the Camp Logan Mutiny of August 1917 in the city of Houston, when, as you suggest, Black soldiers, many of whom were not necessarily familiar with the peculiar folkways of Jim Crow then obtaining in Houston, whereby you had to sit in the back of the trolley whereby you were not allowed to go into certain stores to try on clothes or shoes before you could buy them. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at old photographs, you'll oftentimes find Black people in ill-fitting garments because they're not allowed to try them on before they buy them. And as a result of what these soldiers perceived in terms of the roughhousing and manhandling of Black women in particular by the Houston Police Department, they decide to run amok, as it was described in the commercial press at that time, and began shooting up the place. And of course, they're eventually subdued, eventually executed en masse. And you are correct, even though that particular dastardly episode took place within walking distance of where I'm sitting right now, I dare say that if we were to go out on the streets of Houston and interview some of the passersby about that startling episode, many of them would not have heard of it. And that's part of the whitewashing of U.S. history, the whitewashing of Black American history. It's part of this crusade, as noted, that Governor DeSantis is carrying out, but it's not just Governor DeSantis. You mentioned the 1619 Project of Howard University's Nicole Hannah-Jones, formerly of the New York Times, which sought to place the experience of Black people into center of a new story of the history of this country. It led to Mr. Trump, when he was president, and paneling a so-called 1776 commission. I understand that Texas has an 1836 commission to try to rebut particular narratives that seek to tell a truer story of the history of this state, such as represented in the book we're discussing now. And I think, as noted, that those who are seeking to rewrite history, or I should say more accurately, whitewash history, that they should recognize that I trust and I hope that that is a losing gambit. It's a fool's errand, and it will not end well.
So as we were talking, because I remember it was during the pandemic that I had read about this, and the movie actually was done. It was called The 24th. It's streaming on Amazon Prime. And so it actually was released. It's a fictionalized version of what took place, but the movie is called The 24th. So yeah, it was, so I'll have to check that out a little bit later when I pull up Amazon Prime. A few minutes left here. I always ask you this question. I ask every author this question. I think when we talked about I never forget we talked about because you brought up the Juneteenth piece. And matter of fact, I'm going to deal with that before I go to that other question. Because when we talked, the previous book about boxing, you told the story that I was even shocked, and you said it blew you away when you found out that when General Granger showed up, he had some brothers with him.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Houston Chronicle in 2021, when they were marking Juneteenth, Houston Chronicle, of course, is the major newspaper in this part of Texas. They suggested that with General Granger was a brigade of soldiers, 75% of whom were African descent. And there's another story, too, to show you how Black history works. The French, as you know, continue to be major neo-colonizers in Africa. That was beginning during the time when they seized Mexico. So from their colonial perch in what is today's Chad in Africa, they dispatched hundreds of soldiers across the Atlantic to bolster their collapsing regime. And so you had Black soldiers on both sides of the barricades, Black soldiers with General Granger, with the Washington government seeking to repulse the enslavers. And then you had Africans under the aegis of the French who were fighting them. And what I think that this serves to illustrate is not only that Black history is much more complicated than many would imagine, but also I think it illustrates a deeper point, which is going to be important going forward as world demographics change and as a more sizable percentage of human population becomes of African descent. You'll see that these North Atlantic powers, such as represented in Washington and Paris, are going to have to rely more upon Black people's strength. But that's going to be difficult to do as long as, per Governor DeSantis, they're trying to feed us fairy tales about our past, which only helps to generate anger and fury, and hopefully will help to generate an eroding popularity for politicians like General DeSantis.
Last two questions. First, what do you want someone who is in Texas or someone who's not from Texas, what do you want them to take away from this 500+ page book?
A number of things. One, I want these readers to have a better understanding of how we got to this point, a better understanding that's not grounded and based on fairy tales, but grounded and based on fact. And secondly, per the subtitle of this book, there may be dark days ahead. The kinds of police terror and our disproportionate citing on death row is horrid. But given what may be around the corner, believe it or not, given what may be around the corner, we may be looking back at March 2023 as the good old days, as the golden days, believe it or not. And therefore, I would want readers to take away knowledge, because knowledge ultimately is power, and power is what we need in order to repel and repulse those who want to drive us deeper into a ditch.
And the question I always ask every author, doing all the research, is something that always jumps out, is a wow moment. For this book, what was the wow moment?
Well, I've just uttered it. When I found out that there were all these Africans who crossed the Atlantic to fight alongside the French against Black Americans. And in fact, we also know that many of them did not return to what is today's Chad. And so
wow.
You may have in Mexico, you may have in Southern Texas, Black people who are not products of the African slave trade as we understand it, but who are descendants of these Black soldiers who were fighting on behalf of French occupiers in Mexico. I have to say, I didn't know about that before I stumbled across it.
Wow. That's always the amazing thing when one is doing research into our history. And again, and it's the untold history that folks don't realize that is always there. The counter-revolution of 1836, Texas slavery and Jim Crow, and the roots of U.S. fascism. I tell you, Gerald, when I was at the Texas State Capitol, when I saw that big-ass Confederate monument on the Capitol grounds, all I could do was spit on it because there's nothing more shameful than to go to the Texas Capitol. And again, this is you're dealing with today, and you see this massive Confederate monument, and they're trying to claim, oh, they were fighting for a just cause. And I'm like, hell no, they were not.
Hey, good for you, man. I'm glad to hear that you expended some of your body fluid on that monument.
Absolutely. Recorded a video, trashed it, and will forever trash it. Gerald, I appreciate it. Great book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Good luck.
So let me go ahead and go to the third thing that pissed me off. So on Monday, I came home. Did I play golf? I played golf on Monday, I think. So I came home, and my wife was watching this this docuseries on the History Channel, and it was called The Frontiersmen, Men Who Built America. So they have a series of these documentaries, The Men Who Built America. They have The Food That Built America. This is a whole series. And so when I saw this, I saw that one of the executive producers was Leonardo DiCaprio. And so I sit down and I happened to walk in as they were talking about how Davy Crockett and Andrew Jackson were at odds and how Davy Crockett lost his bid for Congress. And then they were talking about how that was a play on Davy Crockett, and then how Davy Crockett then moved to Texas and he was walking into a war raging in Texas. Roll this.
As Crockett begins to settle in, he realizes Texas is on the verge of rebellion. After years of loose governance, Mexican President Santa Anna suddenly imposes new restrictions on settlers. Now, angry Texans...
Santa Anna, he imposes new restrictions on settlers. Now, if you're watching, you will go, I'm curious, what are those new restrictions? They never say. Press play.
...are calling for revolution.
Texas was on the verge of independence, that the Texians...
He says, Texas were on the verge of independence. Okay, go ahead, roll it. Go ahead, roll it.
As they were called, were going to try to become independent from Mexico, and there would be possibilities, land and political opportunity.
In response, Santa Anna sends 500 troops to confiscate weapons and quell unrest. When Texans refuse to give in, he makes plans to retaliate.
Santa Anna is training an army in San Luis Potosí to march against Texas. Santa Anna did not think that this was a local insurgency. He was absolutely convinced the United States was involved. And so that's why the Mexican government was so determined to put down this revolt.
Crockett arrives in Texas at the same time as news of Santa Anna's counterattack.
When Crockett had gone to Texas was really just meant to be an extended hunting expedition and land scout, and he bumbles right into a war for independence.
He stumbles into a war for independence. And I'm just sitting here going, what are they trying to be independent about? Press play.
A number of things happened along the way. One was the appearance of Halley's Comet. And when Halley's Comet appeared in the sky in 1836, some people thought that it meant that David Crockett was coming to Texas to fight for independence.
Here we go again with that independence. And so the docuseries kept going on. And then they went to episode 4. And then I'm watching it. They talk about the Alamo. And they talk about independence, 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 independence. Then they go to the Battle of San Jacinto. Then they talk about what happened there. Roll it.
Suffer just 11 casualties. The crushing defeat leads to Mexico's surrender. And Texas finally wins independence.
Here we go right there. Texas finally wins independence. What in the hell is Texas trying to be independent for? I still haven't answered. Roll it.
Back in Washington, D.C., Jackson welcomes the news. He's dreamed of Texas joining the U.S. for years, but the future of Texas is caught in the growing debate over slavery.
Congress wasn't willing to go along with annexation because Texas would enter the Union with slavery. And the...
Oh my God! We finally hear the word slavery. Press play.
The addition of Texas would tip the balance in the Senate in favor of the pro-slavery side. The result of this was that Texas remained in this limbo for almost a decade.
See, the problem is, I think I know what the problem is. See, the problem is I am the reason them plantation owners couldn't stand reading Negroes. I think that's the real problem. The real problem is I'm one of them Negroes who can read. And so I'm sitting here watching this docuseries, and I'm cussing the whole time because I have this. I have this book. And I've discussed this book on my show. I had the interview with the author. Actually, I got 2 copies of this book. And I'm watching, and I'm like, Leonardo DiCaprio, you really want your name on some lying shit, fake ass stuff? Dr. Gerald Horne joins me right now, professor at the University of Houston, and the title of his book is called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery in Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Book came about during COVID. It is a fascinating book. And I need y'all to understand something. Y'all see how thick this book is? I want y'all to see how thick this book is. I am a native Texan, born and raised in Houston, and every Texan is required to take 7th grade history. And that book is thicker than this book right here. And everything in this book was never in one of those history books I read growing up. Gerald, it pissed me off watching this series to listen to them go, independence, independence, independence. And not one time, Gerald, did they ever say what the hell they were trying to get away from Mexico for.
Well, this is Trumpian history, to put it mildly. As you know more than most, when Texas seceded from Mexico and declared independence in 1836, a central reason was that Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, had moved to abolish slavery. And the slave owners in Texas, including those who led the revolt, and speaking of Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin et al., rather than acquiesce to slavery, they decided to start an independent country, the Republic of Texas, which, interestingly enough, after it came into independence, began to challenge the United States for leading the African slave trade. The Lone Star flag of Texas could be found off the coast of Angola in Southwest Africa, off the coast of Brazil, the major market, off the coast of Cuba. Of course, if you look at your map, you'll see there's a straight shot from Galveston, Texas, the major slave trading port, to Cuba. And so that is what Mr. DiCaprio and his comrades neglected to note.
And Gerald, you lay out in the book, the reason they hated Mexico so much, because there was literally another country that was an abolitionist country bordering the fledgling United States of America.
Well, more than that, when Mexico comes into independence, it also allies with revolutionary Haiti. Abolitionist Haiti, as you know, came into independence as the first Black republic in 1804 and instantaneously began to put pressure on the slave trading powers, including the United States. And then when Texas seceded from Mexico, Haiti had reason to then put pressure on Texas in league with Mexico. And that too outraged the enslavers of Texas, because they thought this was mighty audacious for the Black rulers of Mexico and Haiti to be aligning. And then, of course, they were plotting, speaking of Mexico and Haiti, to invade Spanish-ruled Cuba and liberate the Africans there from enslavement. So they thought that the Mexicans and the Haitians had gotten too big for their britches, and that led to the secession from Mexico by Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and the so-called Texians.
I am not one who believes that you or I have to be in every document, in every sort of thing. But I just found it interesting, Gerald, watching this, and I've seen many of these, and I'm like, wow, all of these historians you talk to, and none of them are Black, and you're having all of these people sharing their thoughts about Texas independence, and nobody utters slavery.
Well, it's even worse because, as you know, the 2020 census showed that Texas has the largest Black population in the United States of America. And in fact, the Texas Black population has been in the vanguard of struggle, as you know more than most, for decades. And so it's a slap in the face of Roland Martin and other Black Houstonians to put this kind of tripe and trash on the airwaves.
And it also, it also has to be, and you're used to it, being a historian, it also has to be offensive that the History Channel, which really should be called the His Story Channel, is presenting these docuseries and offering them up as and this is for the generation of people that don't read, offering this up as somehow, no, this is the stuff you don't know about. So people watch this and they walk away from this and go, I never knew those things. So now what they are doing, which you talked about being Trumpian, they can't stand folks like you because really let's keep telling that white his story and keep advancing that. Douglas Blackman, Pulitzer Prize winning author, a white journalist out of Atlanta. Douglas is a great guy. He was responding to my post because I put it on LinkedIn, which led to us booking you. He said, I haven't seen this series, but Roland Martin's anger and exasperation is dead on about how pop history and pop culture continue to, quote, teach millions of people versions of our history that are simply false, factually wrong, fabricated, empirically disproven. The most nauseating part is how these fictions and perversions of truth are now so often presented with the tools and forms of documentary film and published works that, quote, look authoritative and are effectively endorsed by legitimate networks and publishers we once might have trusted.
Well, as you know, it's wholly consistent with the White House's attack on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is shorthand for attack on affirmative action, which is shorthand further for purging Black people from the historical landscape. It's consistent with the attempts to smother the Smithsonian's National African American Museum in Washington, D.C. It's consistent with what's being debated at the state legislature in Austin as we speak, so-called SB 37, which if it comes into law, will lead to a routing of African American studies departments, Black studies departments, Africana studies departments. They're attempting to poison the minds of our youth to make them enlist willingly in the Trump crusade against Black people.
And again, what happens with these networks, again, for the people who are not going to read your 400 or 500 pages, it's like, oh, I can sit here and I can now just get all of this stuff in one nice place, prepackaged, looks great, tells us, sounds convincing. And what it is it is promoting a flat out lie. It is not being fully accurate. It is what this series is doing. It is portraying these white men, these frontiersmen, the ones who were rugged, who were fighting these savages, those Indians, who were just trying to get a land, and they were just trying to live the American dream. Never use the word stolen, never use the word genocide as you properly use when you describe, even in your introduction, that it was genocide that was being committed against Native Americans.
Indeed. I've studied United States history from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I must say that when you look at the history of Texas, what leaps out at you is the fighting spirit and the militancy of the indigenous, particularly the Comanches. And what's remarkable is that approximately 200 years ago, they were ruling Texas. And today, it's difficult to find one person in Texas of Comanche descent. You would think that some might pose the question, what happened to the Comanches? What happened to the Apaches? What happened to these Native Americans who were ruling the plains not so long ago and now cannot be found?
When I look at this here, when I look at let me pull this up because I'm going to go questions my panel. So panel, y'all get ready. I am on imdb.com right now. And it lists the stars of the documentary. It lists all of the people involved, the writers, and I'm just so I believe in naming it and claiming it. John Ealer is a director. Johnny St. Hours is a director. The writers: Brian Burstein, Zachary Herman, Jeremiah Murphy, Jordan Rosenblum, Peter Sherman, Stephen David, Tim W. Kelly, Yoshi. Let's see here. Yoshi Stone, Adam Jones Siegler for dialogue. They're listed as the writers, and you see the cast here. My wife made this observation. She says, "My God, I'm watching this thing, and I don't see nobody black in this docuseries at all." Oh, that was there's one brother who played Pompey. But this is what I think is important. Also, Gerald, these are the producers of this trash, of this factually incorrect and wrong stuff. Petra Hobel, Thaddeus Busca, Chelsea Coates, Mary Donahue, Sam Epstein, Carter Figueroa, Ronald Freed, Tim W. Kelly, Nick Gutler, Brian Meir, Paul Kleinman, Brian Burstein, Liz DeFore, Nikki Macron, Michael Hampton, Jonathan Soule, Yoshi Stone, Philip Watson, Christian Burns, Stephen David, Jennifer Davidson, Leonardo DiCaprio, Russell McCarroll. Those are executive producers. Now, again, some of these folks participated in some of this series from, you see, 2017, 2018. These are cinematographers. These are editors. This is casting. This is production designer, art director, costume designer, makeup, production manager, everything that goes along with it. The reason all of this is important, Gerald, is because these are the people who are responsible for producing the docuseries, and the History Channel has an obligation that before you air some crap like this, that it needs to be factually correct. And we see documentaries on PBS where they will say, "Oh, no, these things need to be corrected before we put this on the air." The problem that I have is when you air this kind of crap, folk run with it and go, "I saw it on the History Channel. It must be true."
Huh. Well, maybe that's part of the problem, because obviously the History Channel is pumping out propaganda. And we should also ask ourselves, who are the major stockholders in the History Channel? Who are the puppeteers, for example? You cited Mr. DiCaprio, but of course, he is getting a paycheck from someone higher on the food chain. And I think that it's highly appropriate for you to call these people out, just like I think it's even more appropriate for your audience to begin to ask these searching questions as to how this sort of propaganda, which ultimately is an expression of anti-Blackness, how it manages to worm its way into our living room.
Well, the people who own it is A&E. Who owns A&E, go back to my iPad, is the Hearst Corporation. And A&E Global Media also is a joint venture of Hearst and the Walt Disney Company. So A&E falls under the A&E Global Media, falls under the ownership is Hearst and the Walt Disney Company. And so the History Channel is one of the networks that fall underneath that. So the question that we should be asking specifically, I say, definitely are to the producers and the writers and the researchers, because they're doing the docuseries. Then it is airing on the History Channel. So who are the execs in charge of that particular show? And now you go to the owners of the History Channel, which is A&E Global, and that is the Hearst Corporation and the Walt Disney Company. Questions from the panel. I'll start with Michael first.
Hey, Gerald, good to see you again.
Right on.
All right. When we deal with this history, and I teach about Texas independence also, when we talk about the Texas Rangers starting about 1835, 1836, part of their duty was also capturing runaway slaves as well. Okay. Can you talk some about that history also? And we know, I'm glad you mentioned Vicente Guerrero, the second president of Mexico, who was Afro-Latino, former slave, because he abolished slavery in Mexico in 1829.
Well, it's interesting. The Texas Rangers, in many ways, were state-sponsored death squads. Not only were they capturing
domestic terrorists.
Exactly. They were hell on the indigenous population.
Yes.
And keep in mind as well that one of the reasons that the United States itself waged war against Mexico a few years later in 1846, walking away with California, which now bills itself as the fourth largest economy on planet Earth, is because Mexico refused to return runaway Africans who had crossed the border into Mexico, leading to major capital loss on the part of Texas enslavers. It's oftentimes discussed in this country about following the North Star to freedom, which is highly appropriate. That is to say, the Africans escaping north to Canada, but thousands of Africans were escaping south into Mexico.
Correct.
It leads to the war against Mexico, which leads to the denuding of a good deal of Mexican territory.
Yeah.
Let's go to Matt Manning, because he's out of Corpus Christi. Matt?
So, Dr. Horn, I'm a lifelong Texan. I took that Texas history class a lot more recently than Roland because I'm not as long in the tooth. But
guess what? It's the same damn book. That shit ain't changed. Your ass had the same thick ass book.
I'm sure Miss Swafford got that book from you when she taught it to me much more recently than you learned it. And I was shaking my head because Michael literally stole the question I was going to ask. But to just add some contour, I was going to ask Dr. Horn if you'd shed some light on how much what you've seen in terms of, your historical review, how much of that, reticence to return the capital loss was discussed at the time, because obviously I never learned that in Texas history, but clearly that was one of the major impetus behind, their seeking to break away. So how much of that was actually being discussed in documents at the time, if you know?
Well, the newspapers were full of these sorts of stories. Keep in mind as well that these so-called Texians were not above crossing the border into Mexico and snatching dark-skinned people who they thought could pass for an enslaved African, driving them kicking and screaming across the border to work as an enslaved person. This person might not have been a runaway. It might have been an Afro-Mexican, for example. So the Texians raised hell in Mexico, which is one of the reasons, if you talk to Mexicans today, at least those that are intelligent, they have a very negative evaluation of Texas generally and the United States more broadly.
Wanda.
So I just want to talk a little bit actually about the production of the docuseries. As someone who has worked in the entertainment industry for years, I think the unfortunate part about this is that when you distribute a docuseries like this and you have certain names attached, there is a level of trust when it comes to distributing it. So having the name Leonardo DiCaprio attached to something like this, people may not unfortunately watch it ahead of time to fact check it. And that's just as you said, Roland, with Black-led charter schools earlier in the program, there needs to be more of a push for Black-led produced history productions. So on that note, because we're such a media-driven society, I'm just wondering if you have any docuseries that you know of that are Black produced and researched that have been distributed that you would recommend for people to watch.
Well, it just escaped me, but there is a joint Canadian broadcasting, South African broadcasting series on slavery in the United States. If you put those terms into a search engine, will probably emerge. And it presents a view of the United States, and indeed a view of 1776, that is altogether different from the kind of poppycock and balderdash and propaganda we're being fed and will be fed in bountiful amounts coming in the run-up to 2026, the 250th anniversary of the birthday of the United States of America. I should also mention that the Hearst Corporation, which is at the top of the food chain in terms of this docuseries, also controls the Houston Chronicle, the major daily newspaper in this sizable city.
And in fact, the Houston Chronicle is actually the largest newspaper in the Southwest United States.
Exactly. And so what that says to me is that they have less of an excuse to put out falsehoods because they're cited, or at least they have an organ, they have an arm of the corporation right there in the Lone Star State, right there in the state of Texas, in the city of Houston. I read the Houston Chronicle on a regular basis. And I know some of these people who are administering that newspaper, so they really have no excuse for making this sort of production.
Is this what you're referring to, Gerald? I'm on the CBC's Canadian broadcast. This series called Enslaved?
That's one. And there's another one, too, starring the woman, if you can put this into the search.
I will.
The Williams sister's mother in that Will Smith vehicle.
Angelou Ellis.
Exactly. She's in this CBC South African Broadcasting production. I show it to my class.
You mean, that actually aired on, you mean the Book of Negroes?
There it is.
Yeah, that actually aired on BET. BET actually aired that. It's called the Book of Negroes.
Yes.
I
recommend it highly. It's an eye opener. And once again, it's not financed by U.S. entities. It's financed by the Canadians and the South Africans.
Yeah, that actually, what you're talking about aired in 2014. Pull the audio up, please. This is the trailer that Gerald is talking about.
You gotta let go of that Africa thing. This your home now. We's all you got.
Coming to CBC.
We are not in the promised land. Not yet.
I am Aminata Diallo. I seem to have trouble dying. By all accounts, I should not have lived this long.
I have been across the big river, and now I am back.
The Book of Negroes begins Wednesday, January 7th on CBC.
That's what that is. And so I really, Gerald, I was just so irked when I saw that and knowing the true history and knowing that people will watch this and they will think that these people, it was just land, and those horrible Mexicans wouldn't just leave those Western settlers alone, and Davy Crockett and Sam Houston, they all were coming there because they were looking for a better life, leaving the places. No, they were pissed off that Mexico said, we're not going to allow you to continue having slavery in the Texas territory. That's what pissed them off. And they said, nope, they about to jack up the economy. That's the only economy that we have. And we're going to fight. And that's what the Alamo was about. That's what all that crap was about.
And that's what Sandra Bland was about. Recall that a few years ago in Prairie View, Texas, this Black woman wound up dead as a result of an unfortunate encounter with the authorities in that suburb, if you like, of Houston, Texas. George Floyd, not coincidentally, also has roots in the Lone Star State as well.
Yeah, with the same high school I did, Jack Yates High School.
Exactly. And so you cannot separate the kind of misinformation and disinformation that's pumped out through the airwaves that presents a profound representation of anti-Blackness for the kinds of unfortunate slayings and murders that take place all too routinely, inflicted against Black people with roots in the Lone Star State.
And this is one of the reasons why. And again, what happens when you know your history, when you know those things, and people sort of get mad at you. I did this, and a lot of people, Gerald, were not happy with me, but ain't like I gave a damn. When Rick Perry was the governor of Texas, he felt that when Texas A&M joined the Southeastern Conference, that there needed to be something, some trophy or something that was awarded to whoever won the annual game between Texas A&M and the University of South Carolina. So then they settled upon something called the Bonham Trophy. And so this says, few have ever heard of this. And so this is the trophy right here. And you see the Bonham Trophy. Well, a couple of years ago, I was watching the game, and it was on ESPN. They were talking about, hey, where's this trophy? Who had it? Who has it? Where can we find it? Didn't quite understand it. And so, again, when you don't know history, the Bonham Trophy is named and modeled after Alamo battle hero James Bonham. He was from South Carolina, traveled to Texas to fight with the Texians at the Alamo. And so they wanted to talk about it. And really, it got lost. Folks didn't know where in the hell the trophy was and all of that. And I actually did a video early on this, and I said to any Texas A&M player and South Carolina player, especially if you Black, If your ass holds this trophy up, you are holding up a Confederate monument, because anybody who was fighting at the Alamo against Santa Anna's troops, those people were fighting to continue slavery in Texas.
Well, as you know more than most, in Houston in particular, there's still a number of streets named after Confederate heroes. It was not so long ago that the street that's now called Emancipation Avenue near the University of Houston was named after a blood-stained Confederate. And of course, he has not been alone in that ill-fated regard. And so we have a lot of work to do, and I congratulate you for bringing this trashy docuseries to a wider attention of our audience.
We, of course, in a couple of weeks are going to have Juneteenth. And before I let you go, I really just want you, and I shared this with, I was talking to Governor Westmore, and we were talking about Juneteenth, the celebration there. And I said to him, Governor, please do me a favor. I need you and others to make perfectly clear that Juneteenth was not a day of picnics. It was not a day of celebration. It wasn't a day of barbecues and cookouts. That for Black people in Texas, where Juneteenth was founded, it was about freedom. It was the pursuit of economic freedom. It was pursuit of the right to vote, civil rights. I said, what we cannot do is allow that Juneteenth is a national holiday, and it is the only day that actually recognizes and tied to slavery. We cannot allow this to be bastardized and prostituted and turned into a day of partying and line dancing. There has to be a freedom component that tied with it.
Well, more than that, we also need accuracy with regard to Juneteenth. That is to say, the traditional story of the men in blue showing up in Galveston and alerting these enslaved Africans to the reality that supposedly you're free, that's a misrepresentation. First of all, the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, issued by the Lincoln government, did not have any standing in Confederate Texas. Actually, what happens is that the men in blue of the U.S. Army are showing up in Galveston because the enslavers plan to extend slavery back into Mexico. Because recall, Cinco de Mayo, marked on May 5th every year, particularly by our Mexican-American brothers and sisters, the French had taken over Mexico and they were supporting the Confederates. And so the Confederates were going to make a jailbreak into Mexico, dragging, kicking, and screaming enslaved Africans alongside with them so that they could extend the life and legacy of slavery. But what happens with the men in blue showing up in Galveston, they were recruiting these Black men as the Confederacy was collapsing, and they managed to join the men in blue, and then they, along with progressive and patriotic Mexicans, helped to strangle the French-based puppet regime. And interestingly enough, the French puppet leader, Maximilian, he was assassinated, he was killed. He was subjected to the death penalty on June 19th, 1867. And that is a further reason to mark Juneteenth, because June 19th, 1867, in many ways has more resonance and more profundity than June 19th, 1865, which is part of the traditional story.
Last thing I want to do is this here, because as you were talking, you mentioned that documentary, the 6-part series out of Canada. I actually had the director of this movie. It came out during COVID, did not get much attention. It was about a group of Black soldiers in Houston, Texas during Jim Crow who were sick and tired of sick and tired. It's called the 24th. A lot of people had no idea about this. And it was, folks, if y'all pull it up on YouTube, the interview that we did with the director, it was fascinating conversation about the making of this movie. And so, folks, if you're not aware of this, we're just going to play this trailer, then we're going to close this out.
Men of the 24th Infantry. This is Texas. And we have a great opportunity here. Legacy, if proven worthy, will carry us all the way to the shores of France.
Things are a little different down here in the South. A
will expect you men to obey the racial code.
Yes, sir.
Get back with the others.
Just go ahead and drive this machine.
Officer Cross.
This is a white man's world. Every man here has got a lit fuse. Jim Crow's the law. Respect it.
What are we gonna do? The police brutalize us, sir. All we want is to be treated as soldiers.
As military police, you are to ensure order of the men of the 24th Infantry only.
Drop the knife.
Back up!
I was robbed of my honor. You get out of here before they take yours too.
The general can get the 24th in the fight.
He's never going to do that.
What do we do, sir?
William, I've done all I can do here.
We have a problem. We're gonna take our country back.
Law run this town.
There's a militia on the way. Are they?
Which way did they go?
Keep pushing people down. Sooner or later, they rise up.
Can you identify any of the leaders of the mutiny?
When I aimed the gun, I saw a man. He didn't see one back.
That was a black director, black writers, and again, our stories are important. Folks, it's always great to have Gerald. I can say this, I ain't got a problem saying it. I know, Michael, I know you had him on the show, but I think I probably have sold more Gerald Horne books than anybody else. Every time Gerald got a book, he's on the show. He's a prolific writer, an amazing historian, and so I ain't got no problem helping to put coins in Gerald's pockets. Y'all, I'm telling y'all, get this book. Because what Gerald does in here, because it's called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism, and he connects, he's calling it the Counter-Revolution 1836, he's connecting the American Revolution and the Texas Revolution and the Civil War and how all of these things are combined. And if you also, again, want to understand present day. See, this is why every year when Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, they put on the social media, hey, it's Texas Independence Day. And I go, bullshit. This is Texas Continuing Slavery Day. And the reason I call that trophy out, I need black people to stop walking around and unknowingly celebrating Confederate history. And we have been indoctrinated with his story, and that's why that History Channel thing is trash. I have hit somebody in Hollywood who knows DiCaprio. I said, send this to him. I will absolutely send it to the folks at A&E, send it to the folks at Hearst in Disney. Matter of fact, I think Hearst, I think I know a sister who's an executive there, but we can't be silent when this trash is presented that distorts American history, because that's what these people want to do. They don't want Gerald Horne's books in libraries, in schools. They don't want other black authors because they want to continue to perpetuate the lie of American history. Gerald, final word.
Well, once again, I take my hat off to you. I salute Roland Martin, Unfiltered. You're doing a bang-up job. I wish that you would issue an IPO, because I would certainly invest.
Well, that's something that we are, trust me, moving towards. We're just methodically building the network, the shows that we're adding. Y'all, this book is called The Counter-Revolution of 1836. Go ahead and pull up Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Absolutely fascinating history of this country. Dr. Gerald Horne, always great to see you, my brother.
Right on. Good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.